The Immaculate is the new film directed by Michael Mohan and stars none other than Sydney Sweeney. The basic summary of this movie is that Sydney Sweeney is this nun of devout faith who is joined, how do you pronounce this word?
Picturesque.
So basically, Sydney Sweeney is staying in this picturesque, but she ultimately comes to realize some very dark and disturbing secrets about certain religious practices that are being practiced within the picturesque. This was kind of an interesting concept going into the movie, a real Alice in Wonderland type situation where we have the main protagonist who is sort of slowly uncovering the very dark secrets behind a certain organization or facade, but specifically she becomes more involved and deeper into the organization or the place. Very interesting idea, which I felt had so much potential. I think right off the bat, this film definitely does have its fair share of pretty great strengths. For instance, this movie is really well shot at a lot of points. There's some really nice atmospheric shots which really kind of lure you in to this very almost claustrophobic and away from home atmosphere. The place does not feel like home. Even though Sydney Sweeney is accepted among her peers in this movie, it's still just, there's nothing homely about this place. It feels almost like a prison, and especially with how dark and grey the color palette is at a lot of different points of the film. This in and of itself is just a really nice way of immediately establishing the setting and making us feel a little bit of discomfort. I think obviously that is an important part of horror movies, setting the stage and making the audience feel a bit uneasy, unless you do want to make them feel easy but sort of lure them into a very comfortable atmosphere like certain films do. But this is not the case with this movie. The idea is, even despite the fact that she is unaware of the horrors that she would have to endure as the film progresses, it does not feel like a very fun place to be in, which is very much by design, because really by the end of the film we kind of just want her to get out of there. But I think that in terms of setting up the atmosphere, the movie does such a great job. I think one of the things I'm just not big on though personally is that even despite how well they set up the atmosphere, it can be a bit over the top in terms of things like the musical score. This is one of those movies that doesn't utilize its music particularly brilliantly. At times just really irritating and overbearing. I think it should just be relying on the characters and the atmosphere that it has so well built up. I would hope that it does that, but unfortunately this movie doesn't do that all the time. Now I will say, despite music problems, Sydney Sweeney does convey what she needs to convey super well. She is, in this film, really just great. And to be honest, I think without her, this film would just not be nearly as interesting, because she really carries the entire experience. Even setting atmosphere aside, obviously you need more to make a good horror film. Other characters, including villainous characters, are quite obvious. You could put them in the movie Venom and they'd be the same character. I just have such a massive problem with villains really having an important role in the narrative if they don't contribute that much in terms of making the audience feel something. The main antagonist in this movie is so unscary, just so uninteresting. It's like, why am I watching this dude? Why isn't there something more interesting? At least get a more interesting villain, or this intangible force of evil if you want to. But this movie doesn't want to do that, which is fair enough, because not every horror movie is trying to be The Shining, and I respect that. But in this case, I think that you should be utilizing your villains a lot better if you want them to have real control of the story. Like, I think what they're doing is kind of Get Out-esque. So obviously when we're thinking about comparing Get Out and Immaculate, two obviously very different movies, but if we're comparing them in terms of their social subtext, Get Out is obviously about racism. Immaculate is more about abuse against women in religious practices. This is one of those films that really conveys the idea that we should not be letting our religion or morality hurt others. And in this case, that is very much a thing that happens. This man is driven by what he believes to be the right thing. He believes he can strengthen his relationship with God, but at the same time, what he's doing is not actually even remotely acceptable. It is just, when you look at it from that objective point of view, which this movie is obviously trying to do, what he's doing is disgusting. And I think the film highlights that really, really well, except for the fact that the villain is just not interesting. I feel like the villain is such a boring waste of time to just be watching. The performance isn't even that convincing. He's your basic mustache twirling evil guy. He's not really that interesting or that complex as a character. He's just kind of evil. And that's his entire gig. But he's not exactly scary. There's a couple of moments where I will say he was pretty intimidating. I think the film had a couple of really special moments there. But at the same time, for the most part, I did not care about him. I felt like he was just some random dude who was just doing something really bad, which I won't spoil. But he was doing something really bad. And it's kind of like, hey, don't do that. I think that this film in general is kind of really just pushed back by certain things. The violence in this movie and the shock value is just not 100% necessary. It's just not something that we needed in this movie all the time. Like, sure, a couple of moments is fine to really kind of establish the stakes and also just the grittiness of this environment, but there's certain scenes of this film that are just so unnecessarily gross. Like, they don't do anything to service the movie. They just kind of exist to give you shock. This movie is just existing for shock value. It's just giving you this violent imagery, which, by the way, very convincing, great makeup and great special effects, and very practical as well, but it's just not necessary all the time. Like, we don't need this. We don't need to see these scenes. There's certain things that just happens in this movie. It's just so unnecessary. I do appreciate the narrative going deeper and darker into this very bleak and unsettling world. There's something very cool about that. But ultimately, the value of that is taken away by the irritating shock value that this film craves. This movie doesn't know how to scare you, so it tries to force it out of you. Again, look, jump scares are like fart jokes, right? Fart jokes are really funny when you time them well and when you actually have something more than just he farted as the joke. Even if it's just irony or it's just funny because a particular character did it. There's timing and there's an actual science into making people laugh. Compare that with jump scares, right? Insidious, that's a great example of a movie that is legitimately unsettling at points, and not just because of the jump scares. The jump scare is merely something that keeps you on edge, but at the same time, the scare exists beyond that. There's actually scary things happening in Insidious. The jump scares aren't even just created by loud thud sound effects. But in this case, there's just loud thud sound effects, and jump scares just kind of happen out of nowhere. There's no good setup and there's no payoff either, because the entire point is that the audience just jumps like, oh shit! It's not gripping. It's unfortunate that a film like this really bites off more than it can actually chew. I'm gonna give Immaculate a 4 out of 10. But anyways, what did you guys think of Immaculate? I want to know what you guys think. Tell me what you guys think about it in the comments, and I'll see you guys later.